You are listening to Cemetery Confessions, the world's #1 goth talk podcast.
All right, hello and welcome back to Cemetery Confessions, the show where goths talk about goth, just like we used to do at house parties after having a few drinks. But now we do it on the internet with you and different guests each episode. This month, we're going to be taking a look at an article from the early 90s discussing the music of the time, the burgeoning interconnectedness of a global culture as the internet starts to become a thing. And we're also going to be talking about notions of authenticity and what it means to be called a poser. We've also got a album review for the new LP from Nox Novacula. We've got Sinister Suggestions and a bunch of other stuff. So as always, I am the Count, and I am here with my fill-in co-host Trey. Hello, Trey.
Hello.
And we are also joined by Harley.
Hi.
And Jon.
Hello.
Thanks for coming on, guys. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
All right, so we're actually just going to jump right into the news.
If this boy did this and the gothic, stuff that went around it and the motive and everything, don't we all sort of want to know, that could be our teenager, that could be our kid doing that. How could that possibly happen?
Being described as being involved with the goth movement, but what exactly is that? We kind of know it when we see it, but some aspects of a goth lifestyle could they provoke such a murder?
Well, I wanted to do something a little different this time around and do a little reflecting on the 90s, era that doesn't seem to get talked about too much. What I initially wanted to do was to take a look at some of the differences and similarities from what people in the 90s were talking about and what our experience in goth culture is today. And there were a few different ways we could take this. You could, have goths that were there in the 90s and interview them. We could do like some comprehensive academic analysis or something. And maybe we'll do that on a future show. But I thought it would be interesting to take an artifact of the time and look at those sentiments and those thoughts and see how we tackle those same issues today. I do want to talk a little about the 90s in general, though, for a moment. In preparation for the show, I was looking for content from the 90s, blogs and zines and that kind of thing. And a lot of the content I was finding were curated lists. So there were like formalized FAQs. There were lists of goth rules, lots of how-to tutorials for hair and DIY, and then lots of lists and information on bands and places to find stuff, like kind of reference sheets, like mail order addresses and club listings by state, all that kind of thing. And it was so weird to remember that, like, we don't give that kind of stuff a second thought today. But that seemed like the bulk of the content that was being discussed because people wanted to know where to get things, where to find stuff. There was some conversation around what I saw called the philosophy of goth a lot. But it seemed like that kind of ended up on message boards and stuff rather than like zines or web articles, which again had like hair dye tutorials, poetry. There was some self-deprecating humor stuff and that kind of thing. And even, thinking about what kind of books were out then, a lot of those were just curated collections of like reference books, shops and clubs and resource guides rather than the kind of what is goth discussion that we see happening a lot now. Trey, I don't know how much you remember of the 90s. Does that seem to be like an accurate representation, or is that just kind of an artifact of what we have left over?
I'd say I was only involved for the latter half of the 90s, but from my memory, yeah, it was pretty accurate, especially around finding resources and the like, since there wasn't the artifact of the internet as effectively. I mean, it was certainly around, but everything was more directories rather than rich search environments and some of the resources we have now. So, I mean, one of the first things I bought internet related when I first got on the internet was an internet directory. It was just a big book with, you want to look about history things. Here are some history web pages. You want to do music. Here are some music web pages. You want to do art. Here's some art web pages.
Yeah.
And this was just general internet. It wasn't goth specific or anything like that. But it was something that I found very useful because there wasn't a good Google type thing at that point. So if you wanted to know about something, you had to know, where to start, where to go. And things like Yahoo, which was one of my first, search engines or hubs that I used to get out into the internet, used to be a directory, which was categorized by topic. So I'd go to like the arts and entertainment section and then the music subcategory and then find stuff about music that way. And I really enjoyed that. And I liked the way that categorized things because I've always been a browser rather than, I know I want this specific thing. How do I search that? And I do kind of miss that in today's internet, and it's very search-focused structure, but I've gotten quite used to searching now as well, so I can usually make do. But yeah, there was a lot of that. As far as the artifacts, I had a couple of the magazines and zines at the time. And yeah, there was certainly a lot of things that were band reviews, upcoming events, some tutorials on how to do things, but not a lot of, as you say, the philosophical discussions about the meaning and métier of goth or what it all boiled down to or how we define it. That was kind of either assumed or just not really felt it was a venue to talk about it. Whereas in like Usenet with Alt Gothic or some of those, that's where more of that happened, where those conversations happened and then were used to develop facts or purity tests, stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, Harley and Jon, what I guess staying on the like searchability thing, what was your experience getting into goth in the first place? Did you have to go through that sort of similar obscurity and sparse information kind of thing, or was it a totally different experience?
For most of the 90s, both of us were in diapers, so there's
yeah,
that.
me too.
And like there you don't know. Most of I don't know, it's so easy to look up. If you want to know about something, you can just like Google it, like do your research on the internet. Probably is a lot easier now than it was back then. Okay, I was on a field trip in elementary school, probably. We went to Cedar Point, and there's just like these group of older kids that were like all in black, and I was just like aesthetically drawn to them. Like, who are these beautiful creatures? And like from there, I kind of took on that aesthetic, but I didn't actually research what goth was until I was in my 20s.
Was that when you came across the term as a thing?
Well, okay. It's more like somebody came up to me at one point and asked me, like, they didn't even pronounce it, like, are you Gothlic? And I'm like, what is Gothlic? What is this thing? Later on, I'm in my room in the dark, and I just looked it up. And then it's like, oh, I do have these similarities.
What about you, Jon? How was your experience?
I mean, back when I was younger, I remember it first caught kind of a good hold of me. I'm the youngest of four brothers, so of course I have three older brothers who the closest of which is 7 years older than me, all into these different alternative scenes all over the place because all of them were kind of oddball sheep in their own way. And through it, I remember being a kid and hearing the Downward Spiral in the background. Just like echoing from my brother's room and wondering what is that. Eventually, I'd end up, inheriting CDs from them to like, from say Rob Zombie, which is kind of out there. But it wasn't until about junior high to middle school that I started introducing myself to things like Velvet Acid Christ, a lot of your kind of more synthy industrial and the like. And then from there, it would grow into being, what it is now, which being broad spectrum, from the alien sex being the Bauhaus, you name it, for the most part. The older stuff, I'm still working on educating myself in fully, because it's like, even today, a lot of it is incredibly hard to get a hold of.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
you gotta go down the rabbit hole.
Yeah. Only recently, a Zorcist album that I've been looking for forever finally showed back up on Spotify. And I'd lost that thing to the depths of YouTube forever ago. And I mean, that streaming music is one thing that it is its own conversation, but at least it popped back up for a second.
That is something we kind of take for granted now, because we think that like everything is on the internet forever, but there is a lot of that more obscure stuff that actually doesn't exist, and then people just forget about it because you can't find it on YouTube or Spotify. And there ends up being this chunk of history that nobody knows about because you can't Google search it.
Yeah, I run into that a lot.
To answer your question, I'm sorry, I did go off on a little bit of a sidetrack there. Back in the day, to find information, or magazines were kind of unheard of around here. Like, the closest you could get was when goth music in that period of time would make its way into kind of more of the mainstream, in terms of where Reznor went with his music, and how, if you're talking late 90s, early 2000s, that's, the time where about, Matrix and other stuff like that begins being talked about, to bring about, a whole new, etc. But it wasn't as easy as it is now to learn so much about a subculture, especially one that you're interested in. And back then, it was all mainly word of mouth. I mean, I still have an old, I think it's Gothic Industrial Madness DVD.
I feel like you have to be looking for it. It's not just going to, pop out at you, easily available.
Yeah, I mean, I was lucky enough to meet a guy who was his name's Mike Sellers. I can't remember. I don't want to say what band he was a guitarist for and misname it, but he's been very embedded in the Gothic subculture for many years. And, of course, through meeting him, I got to get an even further step in. And this was all the stuff that, like you said, faded into obscurity, and you couldn't find it anywhere anymore.
Let's get into this article. I want to read a couple of parts of it and talk about some of the themes here. So this is actually, I don't have a link to this for anyone looking in the show notes. I only had photos. This is from a zine called Aesthetics, and it's an issue from 1993, and it was written by a goth in Germany who had spent some time in, I think he was in California, hanging out with some American goths, and he wanted to write this piece about his perceived differences between the scene in Germany and the scene in America, which I'm sure at the time was like a huge premium for, pre-early internet. All right, so he starts by saying, with a view to greater clarity, I've decided to divide this article into catchphrases, but before I start, I have to define the word industrial to avoid mistakes, because when I was for 6 weeks in the USA, I had the impression that this word is defined there differently. Here in Europe, we mean by industrial music like early SPK, Lust Mord, premature ejaculations, and not music like Front 242 or Skinny Puppy, as some Gothics in San Francisco told me, when they told me which industrial groups they liked. Consequently, if I write about industrial music in my article, I always have the European definition in mind. This was telling just from the beginning. I mean, I actually didn't even pick up on the usage of Gothics until just now. But that the evolution of what we call ourselves is interesting in its own right. But I certainly grew up with the understanding that bands like Skinny Puppy and 242 were industrial. And I do kind of remember hearing talk of there being this division between what Americans and Europeans considered to be industrial. But being that this was an actual point of discussion in the 90s, do you guys feel like we still have these kind of regional definitions of industrial or other genre classifications, or is that all kind of homogenized into a more global grouping?
It has gotten a little homogenized in the sense that travel and the availability of information it's limitless at these days. Outside of countries that it's much harder to get into. There's still a bit of a scene going on out here with like kind of more of the agrotech movement that went with Combi Christ's little role there. And I mean, recently they had Cold Waves over in Chicago where they had Ogre and Frontline Assembly and a few good up and coming ones like Author and Punisher.
Yeah. Oh yeah, they're so good.
Yeah, they did a good show.
Oh yeah, you were there.
Yeah.
I forgot.
Awesome. I'm envious.
I do think we sometimes forget that, or at least for me, I think genre is more of a living, breathing thing. And like, I think that those classifications that we use are valuable to understand what we're talking about, but they're also temporary and develop over time. So when people get super caught up on categorizing explicit goth and not goth music, I think it's just a little messier than that. Like I pulled up, somebody from Germany sent me, there was this kind of like, I guess similar to the Goth Box stuff in the 90s, this series of compilations called Godfathers of German Gothic. And I pulled up the one from, when was this, 1994. And half the bands on here I have never heard of. It's so like Calling Dead Roses, Marquee Moon, Printed at Bismarck's Death, Ashmody Bazaar, Der Fluch, Remain in Silence, Invisible Limits, Dining Lacayan, Dance Macabre. So a bunch of like really cool. Sorry?
I said I like Dining Lacayan. That's the one that I've heard.
Oh my God, they're one of my favorite bands for sure. And it's interesting too because their old stuff was in that kind of dark wave goth genre, and then they branched out from there. And the other thing I thought was interesting that the author focuses on these, so like SBK, Lustmord, Premature Ejaculations. They're kind of like more dark ambient bands. I don't think they really, I don't think they fit into industrial music so much. I think what he was trying to do was take electronic bands that were more atmospheric and fit them into goth, because you did have this kind of, I think in the 90s was when you had this soul searching of, well, industrial's becoming popular and they're at our clubs and we're at their clubs. Is this part of our thing? Do we have to say we're different than them? And I think a lot of people were arguing about that.
I think it's actually more reflective of kind of the first split, or I guess the first ideological split in industrial music, where you had the purists who were thinking, well, industrial music defined by throbbing gristle can't be beat oriented, melodically driven, have any sort of musical phrasing that would lean it towards a pop music or an accessibility standpoint. So everything was closer to the noise side of things, or the very experimental avant-garde side of things, which is where things like SBK, Lustmord, and the like would fit in more closely than your Skinny Puppies or Front 242, which did start incorporating more standard musicological elements of steady rhythmic beats, melodic phrases that are recognizable, etc.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like there was definitely from like your more your more Eastern influence. I'd say earlier Eastern influence. It had much more of like an etheric kind of feel to it, because back then, I think somewhere in this article it actually says that in your European countries, Goths are more inclined to be more paganistic in studying of the runes than to be, like your Anton LaVey Satanist or whatever have you that we have typically over here. Not to shame anybody over here or shame anyone who is an Anton LaVey Satanist, but
yeah, we're gonna get into that. But I just to stick on the industrial thing real quick. People do tend to forget. Obviously, industrial and goth are different, but you had like Premature Ejaculation did a collaboration with Roz Williams, and there's this long history of shared appreciation and collaboration between the two. And so I think people tend to over categorize stuff.
I just see it as, goth itself was kind of the forefront. I mean, before we called it anything, we called it goth. or
Yeah.
if we had to assign a label to it. I mean, industrial is kind of just like the robot goth built in its garage.
I mean, I
I've
kind
never
of
heard
view
it
it
put quite that way before, but
it's a rough and inaccurate distinction, but I kind of view goth as the more rock based, rock and roll based side of it, where industrial's the more electro experimental side of it.
Oh yeah, most definitely. I was speaking strictly from like from a not aesthetic, but rather just like an ideal kind of output, where your industrial is more not, I don't want to say apolitical or anything like that, because it's very political, but it's kind of like the harder edge. Like you said, it's much more of like the experimental, messing with, doing more with more of your technology than your usual reverb and guitars that you would have with your post-punk goth music. Bang on if you bang on a oil drum, you can sound like nobody.
yeah, you have to do it in like a abandoned car park or something, though.
Oh, for sure.
Metalworking factory or whatever.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let me read the next little bit of this here. He says, generally, it's possible to say that the German goth scene is the best and largest scene here in Europe, together with the Italian scene. It is estimated that 14,000 people in Germany, who took this survey? 14,000 people in Germany belong to the scene, and after the fall of the Berlin Wall, a large scene is arising in East Germany and growing steadily. And since approximately 2 years ago, there are two developments to remark about, which have changed the scene a lot. The first development is that more and more Gothics are listening to industrial ritual music. And the second development, unfortunately, is that more and more people wear black just to be cool. Fucking posers. So some things certainly haven't changed between 1993 and today. The sort of frustration that Goths express of the like non-Goth appropriation of, black and other signifiers. But here again, we see that kind of the idea of industrial becoming more popular and Goths trying to figure out what that means for the culture, So, like I said, that music was bleeding over into each other, and even like I'm trying to think about this more. There were Batcave bands experimenting with electronics. Everybody, goes to Alien Sex Fiend immediately. But yeah, Skinny Puppy, and they, experimented with goth sounds. And so I feel like it's interesting to reflect on this stuff, because when you look at what we've gone through historically, like the big contentious things like with cyber goth, and more recently the like new goth and pastel goth and health goth stuff, do you think like now industrial music, because we've had to deal with those other things, that industrial music is more accepted as like, yeah, sure, this can be part of goth culture because at least it's not health goth, or at least it's not ghetto goth or whatever?
Like mumble rappers pretending they're goths.
I mean, it's one thing to just be like, to be a mumble rapper and just to follow their own ideology. The only problem I usually like come to qualms with, because inevitably, as a culture, unless goth does want to try to somehow figure out a way to become undead, it's got to adapt with the changing ideal of people. Yeah. But at the same time, it also has to stay true to its principles. And that's just, I don't want to say it's mimicking, but it's also remembering, why.
Are you paying homage to the roots?
In a sense, to keep it from turning into something that's simply cosmetic. Because without removing, by making it into something like that, then any kind of depth that any of, the music or the movies or anything in our subculture that we liked can be cheapened and turned into something that can be used simply to, say, increase traffic at a website for no reason, like for no benefit of the community, but rather just to benefit someone's pocketbook. You know what I'm saying? So it could turn into more of just another kind of lifeless aesthetic that you can buy at Kohl's, That's the kind of thing that becomes kind of worrisome as the term itself gets thrown around so easily and so easily associated. Instead of being pastel goth, why aren't they just pastel? You know what I'm saying? And I can see where the goth roots can be there, and by all means, but it's just that idea of how many times can you cut something into so many different pieces and still call it the same thing.
Trey, do you feel like because we've gone through all the more recent stuff, that when you get back to the questions of like, well, is Author and Punisher part of the goth thing, that people are less likely to bitch about those types of bands because we've had this other more recent existential crisis, I guess?
I would say kind of yes, I guess. Coming up through the 90s and then looking historically prior to then, there didn't seem to be a lot of tension between the goth side and the industrial side, at least as far as the public space club environment was concerned. All the places that I was first going out to in the mid 90s were quote unquote goth industrial clubs. And it was just kind of, they were put together. They were almost, appended to one another. And there was certainly a distinction, and there were definitely people who liked one over the other, but there didn't seem to be a lot of friction between the two. And it's almost seemed like that's been exacerbated lately. And maybe some of this, these very out there, let's make this new thing goth that has little to nothing to do with it, is maybe making it, less of an issue for people. But I've never seen a particularly strong issue between goth and industrial.
So right at the end of there, I think it's pretty funny that he calls somebody a poser in the article. And I think, yeah, I think in the 90s that kind of came out of this love-hate relationship with and I think he mentions this, the mainstream media, because this was brought up, but we were getting that like second explosion of dark movies and media from, like The Crow or Nightmare Before Christmas or Living Dead Dolls. What was the other? Oh, Johnny the Homicidal Maniac. I think that was the 90s, right?
Yes, but I don't think it was this early in the 90s.
Not that early? Okay.
This would be more Crow era, I think.
Had Todd McFarlane started up Spawn yet? I think he had. At least the comic books.
Yeah.
There's Sandman.
Actually, Crow was
Sandman.
94 exactly.
Okay. Yeah, it seems like, and this is actually, I've heard the argument before, is that because there was all that attention, and then you throw in like the talk shows and, sometimes showing up on the news, like as part of the satanic panic or whatever. It seems like this idea of poser, or at least the idealized version, came out of the need to filter out those negative elements or the people that were seen as just wanting to be into goth for, the cool clothes or to be edgy, but had no real dedication to the music or the culture. And so, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, I agree with you, but also we can't, there was a significant, as far as I saw in the industrial scene, I'm not sure because I wasn't too much into the goth rock scene back when I was during those times. But in the industrial scene, there was always this kind of air of elitism that has always been there. Kind of like the gothic hierarchy. And just from that kind of a standpoint, I could see where the idea of a poser would come in because as part of your identity, you have built this person. And at least in the gothic subculture, I've seen it as it's a serious, like at least in the industrial part, it was kind of an expression of almost personal power, in a way. Power over oneself and one's own fate. That was kind of half the gist of it usually, or how things could actually be much more turnt and much more different than we really thought they were. Psychic TV, yeah, or the Church of Psychic Youth. I had a good friend of mine who is, I haven't read their Bible myself, but he owns it. He's told me all about it. I feel like there has kind of usually been just this air of elitism somewhere inside the goth subculture itself, like there is with any other. But that also kind of contributes to that idea of what is a poser, as much as, kind of like you said, that hatred for, not necessarily hatred, but distaste for people who would turn around and say that, I am this, when you're like, but are you really? Gothic in its own is kind of an idea of self-expression instead of, like it's our showing ourselves as apart from what you could see as atypical. So I feel like to watch someone who's trying to learn those first steps is separating themselves from that atypical. I mean, if they're just doing it for shits and giggles and trying to attract attention to themselves, well, eventually fate will do what fate does best, and that problem will just kind of go away.
Take care of itself.
Yeah. It's just kind of that idea of, are we individuals or are we turning goth into a group now?
On a side note, I'd like to backpedal on the whole industrials being like accepted in the goth like community, and I personally don't see a problem with it. Like when you go to goth clubs in America, it's like a mixture of like your rivet heads and your goths and your punks. It's like a free for all. If you like the music, you're welcome. That's what I think.
Mm-hmm. The Holy Trinity, goth, punk, and industrial.
And it's not so much you're not welcome here. I don't know.
Well, I mean, I have seen some of that.
I mean, online, I have seen it, yes, but actually seeing it in real life in front of you, no.
Well, so I actually have an example about that. I was just talking to someone about this, because I do in theory, the idea of filtering out, I don't know, weekenders to keep the scene healthy is fine. But I do think there are examples of people getting hurt from this. And the one that I was going to use was actually from Gopal Metro. He was in Bella Morte and a few other bands. And he was talking about this trip that he went on he was in a new city. He went to a goth club. I think it was during the 90s. And he talked about how he was like so excited and giddy, and he spent hours doing his hair and makeup, and he was just like, he wanted to connect with other people. So he gets to, I think he described it as like a magical portal to a different dimension with like all these strange, beautiful alien creatures. And so he's out there. He's like, he's proud to be part of this goth culture and proud to be a goth. And he was at a Lycia show, and he said there was like 8 people there, and he goes up to talk to the first person, and he's like, they look super cool, and I went to talk to them, and he was just a total dick. And so he goes one by one, and he goes up to talk to these people in little groups, and he said that they all basically gave him shit for at least what he perceived was this sort of, you're not part of our clique, we don't know you. We want to feel better than this person who may just be a weekender or a poser because we've never seen you here before. And he left feeling just totally devastated because he wanted to be a part of this group. And then he felt like, if that's what the goth thing is, just people being dicks to each other, then I don't really want to have anything to do with that. I've heard, like what you just said, Harley, I've also heard people say that online and in YouTube videos that, well, I don't know anyone who's experienced this, so I don't really think it exists. And I personally have even said that myself, but I've been running into more and more people who have, stated this type of thing, and I don't want to just,
that hurts my heart. And I know that these type of situations do exist, and I am very shy, and the fear of rejection is definitely what keeps me from talking to other people that would be in my peer group, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, that's the thing, is because I've heard people make the argument for why Poser was good in the 90s, because it did instill this fear of being socially destroyed, or having a social death, so that the idea was that would spur people to be productive and be engaged and be respectful and part of the subculture, because they had this fear of being called a poser hanging over their heads.
But then there are people that aren't posers that have that fear, and it keeps them from like our subculture growing.
I would argue that sense of
connecting, not really growing, but connecting.
Yeah, I would argue that, their argument that the posers was a healthy thing because it weeded out people who weren't serious about it was actually, I would say, was counterproductive, because what it's going to weed out is people who aren't confident, people who are new to it, people who just, they're not sure what's going on, but they're trying it out, and they may like it, and it may be a thing that could be good, and they might have been able to do something long term to benefit the scene, but they were then turned off by this gatekeeping effect. Whereas the people who are doing harm, the weekenders, the people who, are just playing goth for a weekend or for a night or whatever, they don't care. They don't care if other people don't care or don't, give them that social cachet. They're just coming in to have a fun night. And if someone gives them shit, they'll just ignore them and continue having a fun night. So what it's going to do is scare away newcomers and do nothing to curb the influx of people who just come in to, enjoy seeing the freaks or to pick up the sexy goth chick or whatever. It's not going to bother them at all.
And like John said, I mean, those people will eventually filter themselves out anyway.
Exactly. Like, I'm glad you said that, because it reminded me exactly what I was about to say. Like, as we've seen in the past, different subcultures get the limelight as time cycles on and continues. Recently, EDM and most of your dance music just exploded for a good solid few years, like when dubstep first came around, and now it's probably a very weak correlation, but back then, because everyone was taking serotonin and everyone was so happy and plur this, plur that, da da da. And now everyone's depressed because they have serotonin syndrome from all the ecstasy they took. So now goth is kind of popular.
I see where you're going.
And we just kind of got to deal with that until they move on.
Well, and I mean, that's like, it's not necessarily a bad thing either, because, again, going back to, The Crow and all that stuff, how do you think people found out that goth was even a thing in the first place? It became popular. And then a lot of people did stick around.
Exactly. It's just the subculture re-rolling itself.
And there's a huge difference between like the movie adaptation and the comic book adaptation of The Crow.
Yeah.
And like in the comic books, J.O. Barr, I'm not specifically sure if he was a goth, but he definitely was a fan of the music. There's lots of like Joy Division references. Like he quotes, doesn't quote, like there's a whole page that's nothing but like the Hanging Garden lyrics. And like it could definitely like, bring people to goth.
Yeah. Or like Death from Sandman, like was brought up. So I bet you're really excited about that Jason Momoa reboot, right?
No, okay, listen. He's not doing it.
Yeah, I know. I just liked seeing people's heads explode over every time there was an article about it.
But he was such a good dark Aquaman. I'm sure he could be an amazing Crow.
But yeah, just to get back to the gatekeeping thing real quick, like there was this argument recently on my own Facebook account, and some people were claiming that gatekeeping didn't exist in the first place in goth, and I just don't agree with it. I don't agree with that, but I also don't agree with the idea that gatekeeping solves a problem, because like Trey was saying, in actual practice, it ends up affecting young people trying to get into the scene, newer members, and it ends up, I think, pushing them away instead of saying,
if you're gonna gatekeep, why don't you like educate a little bit too?
Exactly. Yeah. I don't think it's keeping out metalheads from the what is goth conversation, I think. And I think that is like that conversation is really important, so I understand the desire to want to protect it, because that discussion nature is how we find our group identity and how we understand like what goth is and stuff. But like gatekeeping itself is kind of like a anti-discussion anyway. It suppresses discussion. Like you're saying, Harley, I think the conversation shouldn't. So like what in theory what happens is someone comes into a club, they have a Sisters of Mercy shirt on. Somebody comes up to them and starts a conversation. They're like, "Oh, what's your favorite Sisters album?" And then they don't know, and then they are shunned, and like no one will talk to them. When in reality, what I think the way that conversation should happen is when they say, "I don't know, I've just heard a few of their songs" or whatever. Then instead of being a dick, just like make suggestions. Be like, I would say
that's more helpful.
Or just ask about the songs they like.
Yeah.
Like Sisters of Mercy, you ever listen to Typo?
Yeah. Like if you like spooky vampire music, then First and Last and Always is probably a good album. Or like, Night Sins or Rosetta Stone are pretty similar in sound. Or like bring up a local, like, oh, hey, well, this band's playing next month. Did you know about that? Did you want to check it out? Give them suggestions, and you can just as easily figure out if they're interested in actually being goth or not. Because if they're not going to give a shit. And if they are, then they're going to want to learn. So I just think this.
Give them a chance before you write them off.
Yeah.
So I was going to comment on the. I did read a bit of the article, or not article, I guess, but a little bit of the thread on your Facebook regarding the gatekeepers don't exist. And the main thing I found interesting about it is those who were, I guess, saying that gatekeeping didn't exist seemed to be, though I didn't ask any of them or weigh in myself, but seemed to be defining gatekeeping as, well, gatekeeping doesn't exist in this sort of official capacity, where this concept of gatekeeping has to be an officially sanctioned goth high council that gatekeeps goth in general and isn't the acts of individuals that are just judging people coming in. So it's the idea that gatekeep doesn't exist in this large official capacity, but has no commentary on individuals being assholes. And that's kind of the distinction they seem to be making when they were making those claims that gatekeeping didn't exist, where all the counterexamples were very individualistic, where, I went up to this one person and they said I couldn't be goth because I didn't pass criteria X, Y, and Z. So it was sort of two people talking past each other, defining gatekeeping in a different way as far as how big it was and how explicitly it was defined. But as far as whether it's good or bad, I mean, I stated before that I generally think it's bad. I don't find it useful. It's counterproductive. I do like the approach of, if somebody seems earnest and interested and doesn't know anything, that's not a deal breaker. That's an excuse to start a conversation and to educate. And if you start educating someone by saying they're wrong, you've already turned them off and they're not going to listen to you anymore.
And I mean, I get being, goths being introverted and wanting to protect their safe spaces. I understand that. So I don't want to say it's always bad, but you never know. Like somebody shows up in jeans and white sneakers, maybe they walked into the wrong bar and then they're like, hey, I actually kind of dig this. Maybe I should check it out. And then if no one will talk to them, and everyone gives them just the eye daggers, then maybe that's not good.
Though at the same time, if we're talking gatekeeping nowadays, like Trey said, it's very counterproductive these days. Though back then, I guess I could see why it may have been deemed necessary, just because of the fact that nowadays you have Facebook. You can look people up and figure out anything you want about them if you want to. So now you have more of a window into who that person really is. And it makes people nowadays more likely to have that mentality of, opening up their subculture and their circle, having the idea of, this person's probably open-minded because they've been exposed to this and that and everything else because of the influx of information we have these days.
Sure.
Though back then it was just buy off a flyer you saw posted
Yeah.
up somewhere by word of mouth.
Yeah.
So, the bit of shunning there, to avoid collateral, or probably to avoid, getting a club closed because someone's acting like a douchebag. That kind of gatekeeping I can get because it was necessary back then.
Yeah.
But now it's just unnecessary.
Yeah. I think what we're saying in general is gather some more information. Don't initially be an asshole. And then if someone is clearly something that we would want to keep out of our community, then sure, go ahead. Go right ahead.
Or don't associate yourself with them.
Don't be a dick, dummy.
It's good we could have Wheaton's Law inflicted on the goth scene.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I forgot about that.
Yeah.
I'll make that the title of the episode. No one will understand what it's going to be about. All right, well, let me read the last part I guess we'll cover here. Let's see. In contrast to the American goth scene, the German scene hasn't much to do with the belief in vampires or Satanism, but more with rune magic. A lot of goths have books and runes, and they know very much about this stuff. The main reason for this difference is that the favored groups here in Europe are the goths who have an intellectual association with Death in June, Current 93, Sol Invictus, Sixth Com, Non, Blood Access, Ordo Equium Solis, NWW, Coil, and further Joy of Life, Radio Werewolf, Psychic TV. And in my opinion, as far as I'm able to judge it, the main influences on the American goth scene are groups like Bauhaus, Original Christian Death, and Shadow Project. But all this doesn't mean that groups like Bauhaus aren't heard in Europe. Roz is a star here in Europe, but what I wanted to say is that the main intellectual influences here have other roots than in the USA, but this also doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of bands who are influenced by Roz musically. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff in there. The religious affiliation thing is really interesting to me because goth is non-theistic, but I've been thinking about recently because I deconverted from Christianity a few years ago, and then I've been getting into like practicing paganism and some other things. And there are a lot of pagan references like all over the damn place in goth music and history. And tons of goths seem to be pagans. And I would almost probably say that's like a dominant religious view. And it was probably something I was either subconsciously ignoring or just maybe I didn't have the prerequisite like esoteric information to understand the references. But
Your occult skill is not high enough.
You weren't hearing our pagan dog whistles?
Yeah, exactly. You hear the whistling now, don't you?
There's a lot of like crossover there. There's the ritualistic aspect. There's the obtuse, religious practices and the anachronisms and stuff. And that's sort of ancient mythos that is attractive to goths, I think. But just kind of staying on this idea of American goths being into Satanism.
Didn't LaVey get his start here?
Yeah.
Yeah, he started his church down in Florida. I mean, I guess, it's also an area that's, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to take any words out of your mouth here, but it may be just because of the fact that, out here it's predominantly Christian.
Mm.
So the alternative, the dark, which is, what goth is usually about, being, the dark, finding, the truth or the comfort in that darkness, in that aspect of life and humanity that's, typically looked away from or avoided. Here, predominantly, you'd find vestiges of Satan or, whatever the antithesis is for whatever predominant religion you have. I mean, not to say that you have death cults of goths hanging out in India.
At least not that we'll say on the internet.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I've met very, very few Satanist goths. Not that there's anything wrong with that, and I have met some, and some Satanists are really nice people. But there's certainly not a predominant faith or belief system within within goth. I think a lot of people don't go that way simply because to be a Satanist, you have to some degree, believe in the Christian worldview.
Yeah.
And a lot of goths
well, I guess
just
theistic
don't.
Satanism, right?
Yeah, like through theistic Satanism, you have to have some kind of belief in a Christian worldview. But that's to call it. That's to call it. That's if you put it under the definition of the Christian devil. Lucifer himself. If you were to take that context out and just look for generally supporting the other.
But I think it's interesting that he brings up religion at all in the first place as part of like trying to understand. I think the header of this is differences from the American goth scene. He talks about rune magic. I think it's interesting that that was even part of the conversation. I mean, I don't know. Do you guys, whether you're religious or not religious, does that inform or interact with your identity as a goth?
I am not religious, so I don't think it does. However, I could, in a way, aesthetically, Americans, we wear like a lot of pentagrams or ankhs or like crosses, and like incorporate that into like our style. And I've seen like on Instagram a lot of people that are like from other countries, they do work like runes into their style of dress. I could see it in that way.
Yeah, I think that getting into at least the iconography thing with clothing, that gets into the whole, how much what's appropriation and what isn't, and like, does it go too far when it's Killstar just throwing occult vomit on something? Or is it?
If you're going to wear a symbol, definitely
sure.
know the history behind it.
Sorry, Harley.
Yeah.
But I'd really be interested to find out in this, which is, of course, we can't because we can't interview the author. At least I don't think we can. Is how much of that is European goth versus German/Northern European goth? Because he mentioned, the German scene being one of the biggest ones, and the Italian scene being the other one. And, maybe the Italian scene would be big into runes too, but that would kind of surprise me. And I would think the Italian scene might lead more towards Christian iconography or maybe Egyptian or other pagan roots, or even, some of the old Roman mystery cults or something local, because rune magic is, of course, local to Germany and Northern Europe. A lot of the touchstones for American Gothic, yes, we do have some Christianity or satanic side of things, but there's also a lot of Celtic and Egyptian, and those are the sort of paganistic things that had an influence on American culture, or at least have a little bit more traction with American culture. Well, I do know a fair number of people who are into the Nordic or Germanic religions. It's certainly not nearly as common as some of the other pagan traditions that have influenced American bands, and to a degree the English bands that are sort of the touchstones of goth, for as their example is of American goth.
Yeah, there's got to be some interaction between, I mean, obviously there's philosophical leanings for the type of stuff goths are into, but some of that has to be reactionary to the predominant, culture, which I think is a lot of what we see with feminism being a big part of goth for a lot of people because of the culture that we live in. And I'm sure some of that comes out of the religious esoteric symbology, comes out of, living in the dominant culture being predominantly Christian, and in the 90s certainly very antagonistic towards a goth expression. So going to pre-Christian or anti-Christian ideologies and religious views kind of makes sense from that angle as well. I think the vampire thing kind of threw me for a loop, though, because I guess if vampires weren't a part of the goth...
Bela Lugosi's dead.
Yeah.
Come on.
I mean, that was definitely a big part of the story in film culture, and also a lot of what inspired, most of the fiction that came from the gothic subculture of its own. And that's also half of what bleeds into the esoteric being such a big part of goth. it's that dabbling in the taboo. It's that looking to things in the dark, or looking at things that society or the world in general typically would see as dark, and just trying to find that in yourself and accepting it, becoming it. And I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I mean, I kind of believe that knowledge in its own kind of holds a very similar Lovecrafty kind of standpoint on reality, to where if you achieve too much of it and you learn too much and understand too much, eventually what is left of you that was there? Because isn't us the mystery of us? And of course, goths choose to explore that darker aspect of us that we try not to look at. And because now everything's coming to light, you know, like with the feminist movement, with just the fact that information can travel as fast as it does, and we can learn about all these different ways, that really, like, the veil itself has been lifted from a lot of people. Nowadays, it's getting hard to keep up with information, so those who seek to suppress it can't do that as fast. And more people are becoming educated. It's becoming hard to figure out what exactly is what. So, I guess Goth will be here to support all those people who feel displaced and cold in a dark world because of that.
And vampires.
Yeah, and vampires. Sorry, I got kind of sidetracked.
No, yeah. No, I mean, the vampire... Go ahead.
I was going to say, I also don't necessarily see vampires as a huge thematic touchstone, at least within the musical side of things. There's certainly the aesthetic touchstone. It's a very good way to dress dark and to have that sort of traditional, you know, Gothic look is got its vampiric influences. But there's not a lot of allusions in, you know, I guess it's not rife in American Gothic bands that they're always talking about vampires here and vampires there. Most of the overt vampire songs are from England.
Yeah, like the Damned and stuff. Well, I mean, in Germany now, you obviously have Blue Dangle, that Heimatard, however you say that band's name.
Nosferatu.
Yeah.
No, there's a huge tradition of vampirism, or at least the beliefs in vampirism, and that it's got a certainly good German side of it too. But maybe it's not as influential in their goth culture, and maybe it was just an aesthetic thing that he's referring to.
I wanted to clarify that I meant the band Nosferatu. Not
yes.
Nosferatu.
Not the movie or book.
Yeah.
Okay. Or book.
Or the clan.
Or the plushie. Or the clan. Yeah. I mean, you're right, Trey. He does kind of tie that to a music thing where, like, he's comparing the American lineage to death rock, because I think that's where he visited. It was in California. Which I'm not even going to touch. We're not going to have time to touch the conversation around the bands he lists, because some of them are just like explicitly Nazi bands. They certainly did have their own cultural history with, I don't think he mentioned Malaria, but even Berlin or German-based bands, you had like Nick Cave and David Bowie and other musicians coming to Germany to make music. They had kind of their own separate thing going on, at least before all of this blended together, you know, post 90s. But I did want to ask if, for you, the sort of vampire archetype was part of your development as a goth, or was meaningful to you in some way growing up or getting into darker things.
Oh, for sure. At least on my end. I mean, I mentioned VTM earlier, and as a kid, you know, discovering VTM when I was maybe 7 years old or so, suddenly I found this book and I'm reading it and I'm seeing all this dark, deep internal story, and it brought me much deeper into the subculture that was goth, because from that I learned about the music, and then from there I learned, you know, the aesthetic, and then the history, etc. So I guess you could say that vampires were very important in that aspect.
I haven't gave it much thought, honestly. I don't think it had a lot to do with me getting into the subculture. It was more of just an interest that I had, basically just watching a ton of vampire films. Well, I guess if you want to talk about corpse paint,
Well, I think just thinking about this a little more, considering this was 93, I do think a lot of when the hyper vampire stuff came into goth was around the 90s, because you had Anne Rice, Poppy Z. Bright, Vampire the Masquerade. You had the like romantic goth thing kind of started in the 90s as well, and that brought in a lot of that, hyper romantic stuff.
Poppy Z. Bright's like Lost Souls was
Yeah.
like a big influence, because she quote real bands that you could look up and you could listen to, that these like vampires are like driving around. Yeah. So I guess in that aspect, I never thought about it.
What about you, Trey? I don't think I've ever asked you this question.
You haven't. For me, really early on when I first started getting into it, I actually got into vampires a little bit before I got into goth, and that was part of a gateway because I was reading, Anne Rice and Poppy Z. Bright and Tanith Lee and Storm Constantine, and some of that got into more pagan stuff, but they all had sort of a vampire iconography going on. And that was something I was definitely into in probably latter day high school, right around when I was getting into goth. And then I found bands like Typo Negative with their own vampiric influences and the like. And that was sort of what broke me into goth. But I kind of drifted away from it at the same time. I mean, part of my aesthetic definitely has informed my aesthetic, because I definitely did gravitate towards that 90s romantic goth style, and I still really do lean towards that, the very sort of aristocratic medieval Renaissance style, the high vampire aesthetic, though I've never been keen on going so far as to do the fangs or corpse paint or anything like that. So I've never really wanted to go full vampire, but definitely the fashion sense, it's informed me there. But I mean, I guess I kind of got sick of vampires a little bit. I still enjoy vampires and look into vampire stuff every once in a while, but it's not a huge focus of mine. And I find it sometimes a little bit cloying when, a band or an artist or something is just going whole hog on this vampire thing. It's become almost a cliche. So I tend to sort of veer away from it now, because it had become such a cliche, and I kind of burned myself out of it early on. But it's still, I feel it's an important touchstone. It's just not something that I necessarily keep up with and let inform my continuing existence within the community.
Do you guys feel like the vampire mythos is still relevant to the goth experience or like goth culture in general today, or more or less relevant, I guess, than it used to be?
That one is a tough one to answer, because it really just it depends on what part of the subculture you're really coming into. Because, I mean, if you're looking at goth as more of a romanticized kind of a dark, sanguine mixture, mind you, of both pleasure and the kind of dark, taboo nature of what it is to be, like either fetishist or whatever have you. And vampires will always be kind of a staple in that, because vampires themselves are taboo and sexual in nature. It's, one of those kind of taking something from someone kind of an idea, which will always play in as, part of the whole S&M subculture that kind of permeates in the goth subculture itself.
Yeah, I think I'm like you, Trey. Thinking about this question, it's hard to tell if because I lived and breathed vampires for so many years, if I'm just kind of a little sick of vampires, then I project that onto it's not really relevant anymore, or if that's actually the case. And it's just really hard to tell.
On the other hand, I get really excited when I'm listening to music and it's very clear to me that they're singing about vampires. Like, in that sense, I guess,
I mean,
I am influenced by it. Like, okay, so one of my favorite songs by Susie and the Banshees is The Night Shift, and I'm pretty sure that's about, like, a woman being visited by like this dark entity, probably a vampire, or like in my mind, that's how I paint it.
Well, I mean, I guess it will always be relevant in the sense that it's still a timestamp of what was incredibly relevant in the goth culture. You know, to be part of the culture, you have to pay some credence to the culture. Otherwise, you yourself are. I guess that could be what we could define closest nowadays as what a poser would be. Someone claiming the culture and making absolutely zero effort to learn anything about it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, goth has at least left a mark on the vampire mythos itself, because a lot of the media and movies and books and comics and things take a lot of inspiration from goth. And I think there's even a class in maybe it wasn't VTM, I think it was Mage the Awakening, that there was like a class that was specifically supposed to be a goth. But I think that relationship has been so close for so long that I think it's going to take a lot to separate that. And I mean, there's so many parallels between the vampire mythos, like you were already talking about, John, that I think it's always going to kind of be there.
Album review.
All right, so this month we are reviewing the new album from the band Nox Novacula. Their Bandcamp page says, emanating from the pallid, meager cemetery known as Seattle, Washington, Nox Novacula, speaking of vampires, assumed the form of flesh in 2017 in an attempt to spread their hymns of gothic rock and roll to the unassuming masses. Nox Novacula breathes a breath of cold, dead air over the corpse of the modern goth and death rock scene. So I am going to play a track off of the album to get us started, and I'm going to play the first track, which is called The Path. Well, Harley, why don't you want to tell us a little bit about how you felt about the album?
All right, I really enjoyed the album. It was one of those that I could listen to from like beginning to end without skipping tracks, which is very rare for me. The vocalist, I believe her name is Charlotte. To me, she sounds like very similar to like Anne Marie Hurst from Skeletal Family and like Dinah Cancer of like 45 Grave. And I love the instrumentals. Like the guitar is amazing. I really liked the song like Michelle. And I feel like the reason why I liked it was it dealt with like themes of, I don't know if you're going to need like a trigger warning or like one of those warnings, but parental abuse. And it like made me think of like Chop Chop from Skeletal Family and like Party Time by 45 Grave, which has like this similar subject matter. And I liked Vultures. It reminded me of like this spoken word, I guess, where you're not really singing, but you're singing.
Awesome. What would you give it out of 5?
4. Solid 4.
Yeah. So I also absolutely loved this album. I listened to it like 4 or 5 times today at work, and it's so good. You've got really atmospheric goth rock tracks like the last song, which was The Cold, where there's this really moody vocal depth, which gets backed up by that heavy, dark sound that I love from a good gothic rock band. And then the first track we played was more of the kind of straightforward, dancey post-punk kind of track that scratches that mid-'80s sort of post-punk sound. And so I thought there was a good variety. They went back and forth between the goth rock sound and the post-punk stuff. Somebody recently recommended the band what was it, Her Despair, as a, because I really love romantic goth rock and like dark, moody, like straightforward gothic rock, but that band was a huge disappointment to me because it was too cheesy and it wasn't well done. The vocals were really boring, and
Which one?
Her Despair. It was just bad. It was like a hymn reject band. I just thought it was like the most unimaginative goth rock ever. Like they just put in a bunch of presets and it was just straightforward kind of stuff. But something like this, like especially that last track, The Cold, was exactly the type of thing I'd want from a gothic rock band in 2018. And again, like I can't overstate how good the vocal delivery was. I thought it was fantastic. So for me, I'm giving this a 4.5 out of 5, and I very much look forward to more music from them or a tour maybe, but definitely go check it out on Bandcamp, see if you are into that kind of thing, and buy it if you like it.
Her vocals are so good. Listen to it.
Trey, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I can give a little bit of thoughts here. Unfortunately, I didn't get around to even remembering there was a music part to review to this until like this evening before recording, and so I jumped onto the Bandcamp and kind of skipped through the first few tracks, so I didn't actually listen to anything in total, but just got a decent feel, and I will definitely be going back and listening through it all the way through, because it did grab me. I definitely got some interest. I definitely heard the Skeletal Family influence there. That was one of the first things. As soon as that first song started playing, like, oh yeah, that's definitely got some Skeletal Family. The second song kind of brought in a little bit of Susie as well, which, I mean, Susie and the Banshees are one of my favorite goth bands, so that is definitely going to pique my interest. But overall, I liked it. I did like what I heard so far, and I'm interested to hear the rest of it. So yeah, I definitely say for those who are interested, check it out. If you like any of those sort of female-fronted, more traditional goth rock bands, I think this would probably be right up your alley.
Yeah, and I'm always here for female-driven goth bands because they're just always so fucking good. They're always so good and have such unique takes on stuff, and it's I love this band. I love this band so much.
So you've got to be interested in death. It's the last great taboo. It's the only taboo left.
Precisely. I mean, why is it, do you think, that everyone in here is dressed in black? It's a celebration of death.
No, I just like the clothes.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, the clothes look good. Yeah, I mean, death looks good. Charles Manson, yeah? No, he was cool.
Don't know if I mentioned it before, but I'm actually a vampire.
Sinister Suggestions.
Yeah, suggestions. I'd say lately I've been digging really deep into the latest rendition of VTM, trying to support Wyvil because they're trying to produce version 5.0. They actually had a little bit of turmoil recently.
Did you? Yeah. Have you read the full new player's handbook?
Yes.
And what did you think? Because I've been hearing really mixed reviews, like people that are really pissed and people that think it's really good.
Well, on one end, it kind of separates and changes things, but on the other end, it finally answers, a lot of the questions that have always been kind of looming in VTM. And it condenses a few disciplines. It leans more towards the storyteller system than anything else. It tries not to bog itself down with dice rolls. It allows you to actually take on different facilities and what kind of support you could get from having a larger base build up, and it follows the relationship map system where it's more about the politics of how you affect the area you're in rather than your individual survival as a K-Knight. Because right now in the vampire universe, and I'm not going to spoil anything, it's just a lot of elders have been disappearing towards the Middle Eastern area, and people are kind of wondering what's going on. Yeah. But the lower generations aren't really affected by it. Thin bloods that are popping up.
I did think that part of it was really cool, at least. Harley, anything?
I have a not goth band to suggest. They're very good.
Get off my show.
Have you heard of Ritual Howls?
Oh yeah, I love Ritual Howls.
This is alternative, but I don't know. There's something about it.
I want to say we reviewed them on an episode, but
Did you?
now I'm not totally sure. I've listened to them a lot, so now it's hard to remember what we've actually reviewed. But yeah, absolutely check them out.
And a creepy movie, The Haunting, or TV series actually, it's on Netflix, The Haunting of Hill House. Have you seen that?
So I watched the first episode and I didn't get into it, but everybody keeps telling me to revisit it. Okay.
I would recommend. 10/10 would recommend.
Okay. Yeah, everybody keeps yelling at me about that, so I'm going to have to watch it. All right. Trey, what about you?
So I will plug a book series that I'm just finishing up now. It's a YA series that it's kind of been on my to-read list for a while, but it's Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials trilogy. They did release the first of the books several years ago as a movie. That was The Golden Compass. Which I saw, and it didn't really, I don't even remember seeing it. I remember that I have seen it, but I don't remember anything about it. But the reason I got back into it and decided to sit down and read, or in my case, listen to it, is that I don't remember where it was, but somebody described it as it's like the Chronicles of Narnia if instead of Christian allegory, it was atheist allegory. And that kind of really I'm interested in how that works, because I did like the Chronicles of Narnia, but it can be a little bit on the nose with its theology and a little bit heavy-handed with some of the allegory. And so this is kind of a similar one in that it is sort of a fantasy world, though it's less fantastical fantasy. It's more of a multiverse thing. It has a little bit of an underlying physics thing going on too, which is kind of fun with quantum theory and multiple universes and that sort of thing. But I've been really enjoying it. I'm about halfway through the last book of the trilogy at this point, and I have been doing the audiobooks because it's narrated by the author with cast of basically it's a BBC radio drama. So full cast BBC production with the author narrating. And it's very, very well done. And it's a really interesting book. When I listened to the first book, it didn't really grab me. It was the second and third book that really roped me in. The first one was good. It wasn't a slog, but it just was somewhat forgettable, but it was sort of laying a groundwork where the rest of the series kind of pushed ahead, and it had grabbed me at this point. So I'm quite enjoying it. I do recommend it. Yeah, definitely check it out if you have any interest in sort of semi-light philosophical YA literature in the sci-fi fantasy realm.
Nice. Very good. All right. Well, my suggestion is kind of a follow-up from the political episode. It was something I actually meant to recommend at the end of that episode, and I forgot about it. But it's the Netflix special from Darren Brown, the newest one, called Sacrifice. I don't want to say too much about it because I don't want to ruin it, but the premise is basically that they take someone who is anti-immigrant and kind of racist, and the goal is to turn them into somebody who will actually take a bullet and die for someone who is not a citizen. So that's the premise. And the reason I liked it and the reason I wanted to recommend it as a follow-up to the sort of themes we were talking about in the political episode is that the core of it is about this dialogue between the sort of bifurcated political sides being where humanity emerges, which is what I'm more interested in, rather than the kind of political ideology, but sort of the stories that we tell ourselves and how those impact the way that we treat each other, which I guess kind of to take a shot at how we ended the discussion, Trey, is where I think I fall in with Darren Brown more than with the idea that inclusivity being inherently political, but rather that it's about the story of humanity and how we interact with each other being more intrinsically just part of social interaction more than politics. But I don't want to get into that conversation because I know you're going to disagree with me, which is fine. Just put that on record. But the special itself, I think, is really good, really heartwarming, and very interesting as sort of a way to reflect on what drives our behaviors and why we treat people in certain ways. So I definitely recommend it. That's called Sacrifice on Netflix. So Harley and Jon, do you guys have anything online you would want to point people to check out, projects and anything like that?
In my spare time, I make jewelry, specifically bone jewelry, and all of it's cruelty free. I'm kind of like a vulture. I scavenge, and I bleach all of the bones and stuff. Every once in a while, I post things on my Instagram. I vend. A big thing here is the EDM scene, and they have shows, and a lot of times I vend there. It's the only thing going on, really. And I do pyrography on the side. I'm kind of getting into that, but I haven't posted anything for sale. And pyrography is wood burning, for those that don't know.
I was like, yes, that sounds very cool.
And you can look if you'd want to look out for that. I post things on my Instagram. It's at Real Down Tomorrow's Girl.
Nice, very nice. And I'll have a link to that in the show notes as well if people want to click it and jump over there. All right, guys, thanks again for hanging out. This was a lot of fun. I appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, yeah. Exactly.
Thank you for having us.
As a quick announcement before we get out of here, most of you know next month is our hiatus for the year. That's in January. We take a month off to take stock of what has come and look forward to what is coming. I take time to sort of take a look at the show format and schedule at least the next 8 months worth of episodes. I contact guests, especially if we're interviewing musicians or people that have really busy schedules. And there is a lot of really awesome stuff that's going to be coming up next year. So we take that time off. Also, we take off, for Christmas, for my birthday, my son's birthday. There's some other stuff going on that month. That said, if you are going to be missing the show and would like to get some bonus content, Patreon members will have access to a Patreon-only Google Hangout. It's going to be about 6 or 7 hours long. It'll be our stand-in for an episode that month. I will be on hanging out with everyone. People can come and go as they please, and we're all going to get to just relax and have a chat, have a drink, and spend some time together. You'll also get access to the video I do at the end of every year that talks about what we have scheduled for the next year, what we're looking forward to, what guests we've confirmed, what the topics are going to be, all of that sort of thing. You can get access to that starting at the $1 level. So if you don't want to miss out for our January episode and you want to get access to bonus content and future things that's coming up, head over to patreon.com/cemeteryconfessions. We've had a few people drop out in the last few weeks, which makes sense. It's the holidays and everything. But if you've been on the fence and you enjoy the show, it's just $12 a year, $1 a month. I think it's for the cost, for what you get and what you pay. I think it's well worth joining. So I would, of course, like to thank everyone who supports us on Patreon at the Founders level for October, pre the cancellations. We have SJ, Esmeralda, Abigail, and Stella. My God, thank you all so much for continuing to support and keep us on the air. I hope you are enjoying the gifts, the mugs that have gone out again, as well to Fifth Dream, our raffle winner for this month. I hope you're enjoying all the exclusive merch you've got coming your way. Thanks again for supporting us. At the Nocturnal Council level, we have Kyra, Dawn, Jason, Sarah, Hayshaker, Natalie, Isidoro, Michelle, Azzy, Michelle, Thomas, Trey, Amber, Fifth Dream, Nephilim, Miranda, Stevie, Amy, Ivy, Mike Mess, William, Heather, and Christine. Thank you so much for your support. And finally, at the Crow's Call level, we have Esther, David, Isabel, Rabin, Eric, Ava, Christina, Such Horrors, Dolly Daggers, Irene, Becca, Kelly, Sarah Monster, Dom, Michelle, King, Rhinex, Marco, Alex, Andrew, Crowlin, Stuart, Isabel, Margarita, Christian, Marissa, Jamie, Kimberly, Alex, Shelley, Mr. Polar Bear, Dagger Dance, Caroline, Alana, GPS, Eternal Winter, Bronwyn, David, Mark, Angel, Anne, Heather, Honora, Skiamakos, Laurel, Kelly, Joseph, Gopal, Susan, Kay, and Beth. Thank you all again so much for your support. We've got some really neat stuff coming up. I'm going to be doing some Patreon live streams and other things. As always, thank you so much for spending time with us. We will be back next week with an episode, very special episode, Goth versus Goth. We've got our very own Trey and our very own Andy Harriman. They're going to be facing off in a battle of wits. They're going to be debating the origin of industrial music. It's a really, really good episode. Another episode that you would have had access to, actually, about, 4 months ago when we recorded it, if you were on Patreon. So if you like getting early access to episodes and other content, again, please consider supporting us at patreon.com/cemeteryconfessions. Thanks again so much for spending time with us. It really means a lot. And until next time, stay dark.
The preceding program is a member of The Belfry, a network of blogs, podcasts, and videos for the darkly inclined. Go to thebelfry.rip for more information.